He walked into that courtroom thinking it was just another hearing, just another judge who wouldn't listen. But what happened next would silence every whisper, every smirk that followed him his whole life. They saw a kid who didn't belong there. What they didn't see was a mind that could tear their entire system apart. In a world where skin color still decides who gets heard and who gets crushed, one teenager was about to rewrite the rules in the very place meant to judge him. He thought he was there to defend himself. But the truth was, he was about to put the whole system on trial. Jalen Dawson was just 19, a quiet kid with sharp mind and a stubborn sense of right and wrong. Most days, he split his time between helping his mom at her small law office and studying late into the night. He wasn't in college yet, but he didn't need to be. He'd been reading legal cases since he was 14, fascinated by how justice could be both powerful and fragile. His mother, Denise, used to say he was born to argue, but only when he knew he was right. Life wasn't easy. Growing up in a neighborhood where police sirens were more common than sleep, Jalen had seen what happened when people like him got caught in the system. He promised himself he'd never end up there, never in that chair, never with those eyes staring down at him from behind the bench. But promises are fragile things when prejudice decides your fate. That morning, he had no idea how fast one misunderstanding would spin out of control, or how a single glance from a judge would ignite the fire he'd been holding inside for years. He thought he understood how the system worked. He was about to find out what happens when it works against you. It started with flashing lights. Jalen was driving home from picking up takeout, the kind of quiet evening where the world feels half asleep. When a police cruiser pulled up behind him, siren blaring, headlights cutting through the dark, his stomach dropped. He wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving, wasn't doing anything wrong. But that didn't matter. Not here. Not with the way those lights always seemed to find him. The officers ordered him out of the car before he could even ask why. Their voices sharp, impatient, rehearsed. Hands where we can see them. He did exactly as they said. The air smelled like rain and exhaust, and for a moment, everything was still, until one officer popped the trunk and another radioed in a possible match. Jalen didn't understand what that meant until he saw it. A silver sedan parked a block away, engine still warm. A stolen car. The report had gone out less than an hour ago, and just like that, he wasn't Jalen Dawson anymore. He was the suspect. They cuffed him on the spot. No explanation. No chance to speak. His protest went unheard, drowned out by the sound of static over their radios. The ride to the station felt endless, every bump in the road echoing in his chest. He kept telling himself it would all be cleared up once they checked the facts, once they realized he wasn't the guy they were looking for. But when he finally stood before Judge Grayson the next morning, reality hit harder than any siren ever could. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, spectators, people waiting for a show. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, didn't waste time painting him as reckless, dangerous, guilty. Every word dripped with confidence. Each phrase rehearsed to make the jury nod along. Caught red-handed, fleeing the scene, no remorse. None of it true, but in that room, truth wasn't what mattered. The judge barely looked at him, only at the stack of papers that told a story someone else had written. To them, he wasn't a kid who loved the law. He was just another case file, another statistic. His mother sat in the back, eyes red but unblinking. She'd seen this before, too many times, people swallowed by a system that claimed to be fair. Jalen felt anger crawl up his spine, but he stayed still, listening, learning, waiting. Then the moment came. The prosecutor called the arresting officer to testify, claiming he personally saw Jalen behind the wheel of the stolen car. Something about it didn't sit right. The report was too neat, too convenient, like a puzzle piece that didn't actually fit. Jalen had studied enough trials to recognize the pattern. The same shortcuts, the same lies dressed as procedure. But no one else seemed to notice, not even the judge. When the defense attorney stumbled through her notes, Jalen knew he could rely on anyone else to tell his story. He'd spent his life studying how to fight injustice, but he never imagined he'd be doing it from the defendant's chair. The moment he stood and said he'd represent himself, the courtroom froze. Gasps, whispers, a mocking smile from Judge Grayson. "You think you can handle this, son?" Jalen didn't answer. He didn't need to, Because deep down, he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who'd been silenced, dismissed, and buried under the weight of someone else's assumptions. And what he was about to do next would make everyone in that courtroom realize they'd underestimated the wrong man. They thought they were about to witness a trial, but what was coming to expose something far more powerful than guilt or innocence. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that hums in your bones, heavy with something unspoken. Jalen stood in the center, papers trembling slightly in his hands. Not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had led him here. The prosecutor's words had just echoed through the room. The defendant was seen behind the wheel. Lies layered over bias, sealed with authority. Jalen looked up at Judge Grayson, the man who had mocked him that morning, and knew this was the moment that would define him. Every eye was on him. The jury, the crowd, the cameras waiting to capture the downfall of another black teenager. He took a breath. Then he began to speak. Calm, deliberate, slicing through the air like a scalpel. He questioned the officer's testimony, piece by piece, exposing cracks that widened with every word. The GPS logs didn't match. The timestamps were off. The arresting officer hadn't even been present when the car was found. Jalen's tone never wavered, his confidence unnerving even the prosecutor, who began flipping through his notes in a panic. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. For the first time, the people watching weren't seeing a criminal. They were seeing the truth unravel. Jalen turned toward the judge, voice steady, asking to admit new evidence, a statement from the car's owner, Raymond Whitaker. The room tensed. Even Grayson hesitated before nodding. When Jalen read the report aloud, every word hit like a hammer. The suspect I saw was white. Gasps, whispers, disbelief. The prosecutor tried to object, but it was too late. The damage was done. Jalen looked up from the page, eyes locking on Grayson's. That statement was omitted from the prosecution's evidence, Your Honor. The judge's face tightened, the realization slowly dawning. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice to ignore the truth because it didn't fit the picture they'd already decided on. For a moment, no one moved. The entire courtroom was frozen in that fragile space between power and reckoning. Jalen's voice softened but didn't shake. This isn't just about me, he said, his words cutting through the silence. It's about every person who's been told their truth doesn't matter because of what they look like. The judge exhaled slowly, the weight of decades of bias pressing down on the room. Even the bailiff, who had chuckled earlier, now stared at the floor. The system had turned on itself, forced to see what it had become. Jalen lowered the papers, his gaze steady, unblinking. He had just dismantled their case, their arrogance, and their assumptions in one breath. But even as the truth hung in the air, he knew it wasn't over. Not really. The system doesn't surrender easily. And as he waited for the judge's ruling, his heart pounded with a mix of hope and fear, the kind that only comes when you've risked everything for justice. The next words from Judge Grayson would decide not just Jalen's fate, but whether the courtroom itself could face the truth it had tried to bury. Judge Grayson's gavel came down with a single word that seemed to echo through time: dismissed. The sound cracked the tension, but it didn't erase it. For a moment, no one moved. Then the whispers began, spreading to the courtroom like ripples across still water. The prosecutor slumped into his chair, eyes darting anywhere but at Jalen. Denise Dawson stood in the back, her hands clasped to her mouth, tears breaking free as relief and disbelief collided in her chest. Jalen didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just stood there, staring at the floor, feeling the weight of everything he'd carried finally start to lift, but not vanish. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions that all blurred together. How did it feel to win? Did you expect this outcome? But none of them were asking the right one. Why did it take a teenager defending himself for the truth to finally be heard? Jalen didn't answer them. He walked past the chaos, his mother's hand gripping his arm, her touch grounding him in a world that still felt tilted. Across the street, Judge Grayson lingered by his car, watching. The arrogance from that morning was gone. In its place was something quieter. Shame, maybe even respect. He had mocked Jalen for thinking he understood the law, but in the end, Jalen had reminded him what justice was supposed to mean. That night, sitting on the steps outside their apartment, Jalen finally let himself breathe. The city hummed around him, restless and unbothered, like nothing extraordinary had happened. But he knew better. Something had shifted, not just in that courtroom, but in him. He had seen the system blink just for a second, and he wasn't going to let it look away again. He opened his old notebook, the one filled with scribbled case notes and dreams of the future, and wrote down one sentence. Next time, I'll be the one standing behind the bench. Because this wasn't victory, it was awakening. He had survived what so many others hadn't, and he refused to waste that chance. For every innocent voice silenced, for every name reduced to a headline, he would speak louder. And maybe, someday, people like Judge Grayson would listen before it was too late. But until then, he would keep fighting, because the truth shouldn't need a genius to be heard. It should only need to be human. So the question isn't whether Jalen won. The real question is, how many more will have to lose before justice finally learns their names?